A head of lettuce grown in a garden on the east side of Salt Lake City could be poisoning you. The contaminant is not a pesticide. It is not a failure of the water supply or a forgotten chemical spill. The poison is arsenic, and it is falling from the sky. It is being carried on the wind from a vast drying lakebed, settling invisibly into the soil and being absorbed directly into the tissue of the food you grow. As of July 2026, more than half the bed of the Great Salt Lake is exposed. 1,183 square miles of pale, toxic sediment, a wound so large it is visible from orbit. This is not speculation. It is the conclusion of a breakthrough study published in April 2026. A team of scientists, led by Molly Blakowski and Dr. Janice Bronny at Utah State University, gathered produce from community gardens and farms along the Wasatch Front, the metropolitan corridor where 2.5 million people live. They tested the leafy greens, and they found them laced with heavy metals, not just arsenic. Uranium, lead, antimony, a cocktail of toxins carried by the dust storms blowing off the exposed lakebed. This is the part of the process that changes everything. The poison cannot be washed off. It is not a residue sitting on the surface of a leaf. It has been drawn up through the roots, integrated into the cellular structure of the plant itself. It has become part of the vegetable. The research confirmed what some scientists had feared for years, that the dust is not just an inhalation hazard to be avoided by staying indoors. It is a contamination of the food chain at its most basic level. Molly Blakowski, the lead author, put it plainly. The dropping levels of the lake have exacerbated the problem. The lake's dust, she noted, is just one part of a complex mixture of atmospheric metal deposition on the Wasatch Front. The source of this poison is an ancient lake, the largest of its kind in the Western Hemisphere, and the story of its slow death is the story of a public health crisis decades in the making. Dr. Benjamin Abbott, a professor of ecosystem ecology at Brigham Young University, does not mince words. We're staring down the barrel of the biggest public health crisis our state has ever seen. The question is no longer if the collapse will happen. The question is what happens to the millions of people who live next to the fallout zone. To understand how a life-giving lake becomes a source of poison, you have to understand how it was broken. By design. In 1959, a decision was made to build a railroad causeway straight across the middle of the Great Salt Lake, a 12-mile-long barrier of rock and fill constructed to serve the ambitions of a growing country. It was an engineering feat. It was also an ecological catastrophe. The causeway acted as a dam, severing the lake's natural circulation. Nearly all the fresh water that feeds the Great Salt Lake comes from three rivers, the Bear, the Weber, and the Jordan, and all of them flow into the South Arm. The North Arm, now called Gunnison Bay, was cut off. Starved. The result was a dramatic and permanent bifurcation of the ecosystem. Today, the South Arm, or Gilbert Bay, is the part of the lake most people recognize. Its salinity fluctuates, but it remains a functioning, living system. The North Arm is something else entirely. With no significant freshwater inflow to balance the relentless evaporation of a terminal basin, the salt content in Gunnison Bay skyrocketed. It is now up to 34% salt, nearly 10 times saltier than the ocean. It is a hypersaline soup, so dense with minerals that most complex life cannot survive. The water there, under the right conditions, turns a lurid, shocking pink, not from pollution, but from the extreme salt-loving microbes that are the only organisms that can thrive in such a hostile environment. Humanity physically split a lake in half, and in doing so, created a perfect preview of what happens when the water stops. The North Arm is a warning, a vast, pink Dead Sea that shows exactly what the rest of the lake will become if the system fails completely. But here is the detail that tells the real story. The South Arm, the living half of the lake, is not just a body of salt water. It is an engine, a biological machine of planetary importance. And the foundation of that entire machine, the absolute base of the food web, is something that looks like a rock. They are called microbialites. Strange, reef-like mounds built up over thousands of years by immense colonies of microbes, mostly cyanobacteria. They are, as scientists from the Utah Geological Survey have called them, living rocks. These structures coat the lake bottom, creating a vast, submerged city of microbial life. Michael Vanden Berg of the UGS and Dr. Bonnie Baxter of Westminster University warned of their importance. Without these critical structures, they wrote, impacts will be amplified up the food chain. And that food chain is astonishingly rich. The microbialites provide sustenance for vast clouds of brine flies. Those flies, along with trillions of tiny crustaceans called brine shrimp, become a protein-rich feast for millions of birds. Over 10 million migratory birds, representing more than 330 distinct species, depend on the Great Salt Lake every single year. It is a critical stopover on the Pacific Flyway, a hemispheric superhighway for birds traveling from as far as the Canadian Arctic to the tip of South America. For many of these species, there is no other gas station. Irid grebes, Wilson's phalaropes, American avocets. They arrive by the hundreds of thousands, an exhausted, feathered tide, to gorge on the lake's bounty and refuel for the next leg of their journey. Dr. Bonnie Baxter, a professor at Westminster University and the director of the Great Salt Lake Institute, has spent her career studying the precise and delicate chemistry of this system. She has identified the tipping points. The south arm of the lake thrives when its salinity is between 12 and 16%. It is the Goldilocks zone, not too fresh, not too salty. If the salinity rises above 17%, the brine shrimp and brine fly populations begin to suffer mass die-offs. The all-you-can-eat buffet for 10 million birds closes. On March 17, 2023, in an effort to raise awareness, Utah's governor, Spencer Cox, signed a bill making the brine shrimp, Artemia franciscana, the official state crustacean. It was a gesture of recognition for a tiny creature that supports a global ecosystem. The irony was that the state was celebrating the shrimp at the very moment its entire world was on the brink of collapse. This is the part the headlines do not capture. This lake is not just an ecological marvel. It is an economic powerhouse for the state of Utah. The brine shrimp, the very same ones feeding the birds, produce dormant eggs called cysts. These cysts float on the water surface, are harvested by a specialized fleet of boats, and are then exported around the world. They are a multi-million-dollar industry, serving as premium, high-protein food for the global aquaculture industry, feeding the fish and shrimp that end up on dinner plates thousands of miles away. The mineral extraction industry also pulls millions of dollars of magnesium and other salts from the lake's concentrated brine. All told, the direct and indirect economic output of the Great Salt Lake is estimated to be between $1.3 and $2.5 billion annually. But the most significant economic contribution the lake makes is invisible. It is the snow. Evaporation from the lake's vast surface area feeds the atmosphere with moisture. This moisture then gets lifted up over the Wasatch Mountains, where it cools and falls as snow. This lake effect precipitation accounts for 5 to 10% of Utah's total annual snowpack. For the ski resorts of the Wasatch Front, that percentage can be even higher. The state's identity, its entire brand, is built on having the greatest snow on Earth. That snow fuels a multi-billion-dollar ski and tourism industry. No lake means less snow. Less snow means a catastrophic blow to the state's economy and its very sense of self. The lake is in essence a massive uncredited subsidy for every ski lift ticket sold in Utah. Now, here's the part nobody is putting on the news. The slow-motion disappearance of this lake is not a cyclical drought. It is a structural deficit decades in the making. And the numbers tell the story. For the Great Salt Lake to be considered healthy, for its microbialites to be safely submerged and its salinity in the proper range, Its surface needs to sit at an elevation of at least 4,198 feet above sea level. For most of the 20th century, it hovered around that mark. The lake had its fat years and its lean years. In 1986 and 1987, it reached its historic recorded high point of roughly 4,211.6 feet, flooding highways and buildings. But since then, the trend has been relentlessly downward. The diversions began over a century ago, damming the Bear, Weber, and Jordan rivers to water the fields and fill the taps of a growing population. For a long time, the lake could absorb the loss. But as agricultural demand grew and the cities of the Wasatch Front exploded in size, the deficit began to mount. The problem was compounded by the aridification of the American West, a long-term drying trend driven by a warming climate. Hotter, drier years meant less snowpack feeding the rivers, and more evaporation pulling water from the lake's surface. On July 15, 2021, the Utah Geological Survey sounded a major alarm. Water levels in Bridger Bay had dropped so low that the vital microbialite structures were being exposed to the air and sun. The base of the food web was dying. Then came the new record. In November of 2022, the south arm of the lake hit its all-time lowest recorded elevation, 4,188.5 feet, nearly 10 feet below the minimum healthy level. It was a moment of national panic. The headlines were stark. The pictures were apocalyptic. A vast, desolate landscape of cracked mud and beached boats. Frantic efforts and a series of wet winters helped the lake claw back a few feet. But as of the summer of 2026, the level stands at a precarious 4,191.1 feet, still critically in the danger zone, still nearly 7 feet below the healthy minimum. A full 1,180 square miles of lakebed remain exposed. That is an area larger than the state of Rhode Island, covered in a fine silt laden with a century of accumulated toxins, waiting for the next gust of wind. The math of the crisis is brutal. According to the state's own Great Salt Lake Strike Team, a coalition of university and agency experts, the lake is running an annual water deficit. To even begin the process of climbing back to a healthy level by the year 2055, the lake needs an additional 800,000 acre-feet of water flowing into it every single year. An acre-foot is the amount of water it takes to cover 1 acre of land with 1 foot of water. 800,000 of them is a staggering volume to conjure in a desert state. The Strike Team's 2026 report, released on January 8th of this year, also shattered a convenient myth. For years, the blame was placed squarely on agriculture, which consumes roughly 65% of the diverted water. But the report revealed a startling new fact. While agricultural use has been the largest drain, outdoor residential water use, watering suburban lawns and gardens along the Wasatch Front, had been historically underestimated. Since 2001, urban outdoor water depletions have spiked by over 60%. The problem was not just out on the farm. It was in every sprinkler head, from Ogden to Provo. And then there is the existential question buried in the dust. Utah is not the first place to face this. There is a terrifying precedent. 180 miles east of Los Angeles, in the high desert of California, lies Owens Lake. Like the Great Salt Lake, it was a large, saline, terminal lake. In the early 20th century, the city of Los Angeles, hungry for water, diverted the Owens River to feed its growth. By 1926, Owens Lake was completely dry. What was left behind was the single largest source of dust pollution in the United States, a toxic playa that kicked up massive dust storms laced with arsenic, cadmium, and other heavy metals, sickening the residents of the Owens Valley. The consequences were not just ecological, they were economic. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency ordered the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power to control the dust. The cost of that cleanup has been mind-boggling. To date, Los Angeles ratepayers have spent over $2.5 billion on dust mitigation at Owens Lake. $2.5 billion. Not to restore the lake, but just to keep its toxic dust on the ground. They have tried everything, covering vast tracts with gravel, building ridge and furrow patterns in the soil, and installing a massive network of sprinklers for shallow flooding. It is a permanent, expensive, and only partially successful solution to an environmental disaster that was entirely man-made. Now consider this. The exposed bed of the Great Salt Lake is already 16 times larger than the entire area of Owens Lake. 16 times. Shallow embayments like Farmington Bay and Bear River Bay, located directly adjacent to major population centers, are already dry, their toxic sediments a direct and immediate threat to the air quality of nearby cities. The cost to suppress the dust from a fully dried Great Salt Lake would not be billions. It would be tens of billions, perhaps hundreds. It would be an economic cataclysm from which the state of Utah might never recover. A threat this profound, this undeniable, has finally, belatedly, forced a political awakening. The prospect of an American toxic dust bowl in the 21st century has created a rare and desperate bipartisan consensus. For years, the state of Utah has been aggressively passing new legislation and allocating funds, a 4-year streak that now tops $1 billion in state investment. The 2026 legislative session, which wrapped on March 30th, was a case in point. Lawmakers passed a suite of new bills designed to get more water to the lake. House Bill 247 raised the royalty tax on brine shrimp harvesting, using the money from one lake industry to fund water leases to save the whole system. House Bill 410 created a new $2.75 million program to pay farmers to lease their water rights back to the state, letting that water flow to the lake instead of the fields. In a landmark deal, the state spent $30 million to acquire the water rights of U.S. Magnesium, a major industrial user. Brian Steed, the state's Great Salt Lake Commissioner and head of the strike team, has become the face of this effort. He embodies the cautious optimism of a state that knows it is in a race against time. Yes, our choices do matter when it comes to this lake, Steed has said, and those choices can actually increase recovery and the speed of recovery. The message is clear. The damage is man-made, and the solution must be, too. The alarm has even reached Washington. On April 3rd, 2026, the White House under President Donald Trump delivered a stunning announcement. The administration's budget proposal for fiscal year 2027 officially requested a historic $1 billion in federal funding to establish a Great Salt Lake preservation program. The plan, to be led by the Department of the Interior, would funnel money into large-scale water leasing and ecosystem restoration. It was a recognition, at the highest level of government, that the collapse of the Great Salt Lake is not a Utah problem. It is a national crisis, one that requires a national response. So the money is flowing. The laws are changing. A generation of water policy is being rewritten in a matter of years. And yet, the lake is still sitting at 4,191.1 feet. It is still 7 feet in the red. The annual water deficit is still 800,000 acre-feet. The effort is unprecedented, but nobody knows if it will be enough, or if it is already too late. 3 questions hang over the Wasatch Front tonight. How do you convince a rapidly growing region to use drastically less water when the taps still run clear and the lawns are still green? What happens to the health of 2.5 million people when the air they breathe becomes a chronic carrier of poison? And will the billions of dollars now pledged from the Utah State Capitol to Washington, D.C. arrive in time to refill a dying lake? Or will they merely be the first down payment on the apocalyptic cost of cleaning up its toxic remains? The dust motes containing arsenic and uranium are right now settled in the topsoil of a community garden in Layton. The afternoon sun is shining. A breeze is picking up off the 1,183 square miles of exposed playa, a pale scar on the landscape. The microbialites of Bridger Bay sit baking in the summer air, their living structures turning to gray cinder. And somewhere high above in the jet stream, a flock of arid grebes, following an instinct carved into their DNA over millennia, looks down upon a landscape that is half water and half desert, searching for a home that is no longer there,